Right, this is the video of the radio broadcast. Let's see. We then put the music on, and then take it to there, and then start. It should start straight away.
The man best known to radio audiences as the awful Paul Glum.
Hello, look who's coming.
Oh, lummy the law. Evening, officer.
What is it, Constable?
I wonder if you could tell me where I could find a Mr. Glum. What name? Glum. Is it in reference to certain unofficial modifications to the coin box of a domestic gas meter?
No, sir, not that.
Oh. Well, is it some hysterical allegation lodged by a fat blonde lady in regard to the gentleman standing behind her last Saturday on the Bakerloo line?
No, sir. No, it's not that either, sir.
I see. Well, officer, I am Mr. Glum.
At its height, the live programmes Take It From Here, which included the antics of the frightful Glum family, was attracting audiences of 20 million, more than even the most successful of today's television programmes. It made Jimmy Edwards, MA, DFC and Master of Foxhounds, one of the most famous voices in Britain, a fame which lasted the best part of 4 decades. Of all the comedians I remember from watching television as a child, Jimmy Edwards is undoubtedly the most memorable. I can picture him now as the blustering, conniving headmaster of Chiselbury School in the Wacko series, apoplectic with rage, flexing his cane before some unfortunate schoolboy who was about to be given 6 of the best. His personality dominated the screen. Frank Muir, who with Dennis Norton wrote both Wacko and Take It From Here, was a lifelong friend.
He had tremendous strength, power as a comedian. I mean, he's one of the last great comedians to hold a huge audience alone on the stage in a comic 20-minute episode act.
If the neighbours complain that you're waking the boys or marring the bliss of their marital joys, just answer with this satisfactory noise.
But underneath the jovial bluster that Jim showed on and off stage, there was an inner turmoil. A turmoil he managed to keep well hidden until almost the end of his career.
He liked his private life to be rather like his theatrical life, I suppose. He wanted to have the same image. I think that he was always sort of ambivalent. I suppose there was always the homosexual angle, and he felt if he led the sort of life he wanted to, he'd be letting down people because it wasn't the image he was supposed to project. He felt that he'd be disappointing people, and he didn't like to disappoint people. So I suppose that basically must have been a bit of a battle going on, don't you, really?
He was able to keep this more complex side of his nature hidden from friends and colleagues. The Jim they knew was the ebullient, jovial character who always liked to be centre stage. Yet when he graduated from Cambridge at the beginning of the war, a career as a comedian was the last thing on his mind.
I was going to teach, but after one term of teaching I got the sack. I was told by the headmaster that I was definitely not cut out for the job. I found it the most frustrating thing I've ever done in my life because I found that the angrier I got, the more the children laughed. This is when I was really teaching, and that's the sort of thing we try to do in Wacko. Attention! Attention, please! Best of order everywhere! Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, to mark this glad occasion among our midst, the lower third have composed a celebration ode, which I should now like to read to you. Crombie?
I'm afraid we haven't quite finished, sir. There's a few words still left out.
Never mind, long as we get the general sentiment. Hand it over. Thank you. Now, ode to commemorate an engagement. Spelt beautifully. 3 M's in commemorate. Oh, pluck the harp and sound the something lyre. Set light our hearts with something, something fire. Come, Cupid, with your something be our patron, while Potter now doth something, something matron.
Professor Jimmy Edwards, as he became known, was in fact the son of a real professor of maths at London University, who was 60 when Jim was born in 1920, and a rather remote figure throughout his childhood. His mother, whom he adored, took the responsibility of running what was even for those days a very large household. As the 8th of 9 children, the young Jim never lost an opportunity to make his presence felt.
We used to put on plays. There was one particular play my sister had written. It was called 5 Birds in a Cage, and it was about people in a lift.
Jimmy's younger sister, Libby.
And Jim played the part of the lift man, and we had all laboriously learned all our words and waiting for our cues and all that sort of thing. And Jim just came, and he hadn't learned his words or anything, and he stood there in the front of us as a lift man in a funny sort of peak cap, being terribly funny, and all the audience was the parents were sort of rolling about and we were absolutely furious because we were waiting to say our bits, and he'd upset it so much, so we all sort of turned on him afterwards. And I always remember people saying to my mother, oh, he's a really born comedian, and that's, I suppose, was the first inkling we had. Otherwise he wasn't very funny, really.
But captive audiences like that were few and far between. In the meantime, the young Jim spent hours at the stables at the back of their house in Woodlands Road, Barnes, a comfortable middle-class neighbourhood in southwest London. Horses were to become just one of Jim's preoccupations. Another he discovered by accident whilst a choral scholar at St Paul's Cathedral Choir School.
Brass came into my life. Now, why? We were made to join a thing called the OTC, Officers Training Corps, and you dressed up in khaki and puttees and big boots and everything, and did a lot of parading. And on one very wet Wednesday afternoon, I'm lying on my stomach on the rugged ground, trying to master the intricacies of a rifle, pouring with rain. And I said to the fellow next to me, who are those chaps in the cricket pavilion in the dry? He said, that's the band. I said, I'm going to be in that.
Within a short time, he'd taken up the trombone, an instrument he was quick to recognise had great comic potential, which he put to good use when up at Cambridge.
He was to play a serious trombone solo, and during the middle of his trombone act, he burst out laughing, playing the trombone solo, and the audience started laughing too, and it became a comic turn, so he built up on that. And the next time the footlight show came on, he did another turn. That was how it started.
Alan Edwards, Jim's elder brother.
He had a facility with the instrument due to putting in many hours. He played certain tunes over and over and over again, especially a tune called The Acrobat. He could play it without even practically putting the thing to his lips. He just do it. He did thousands of times. Every time he went on the stage, he played The Acrobat. That was what he went off with. You know the tune, yeah?
In 1940, Jimmy Edwards joined the RAF, and after a colourful apprenticeship during which he discovered another lifelong preoccupation, alcohol, and grew an impressive moustache, he eventually got his wings and graduated to the Dakotas of Transport Command. It was on his return from supplying the troops holding the notorious Arnhem Bridge that he ran into what he later described as a spot of bother with a German Focke-Wulf. In 1945, as the then unknown Flight Lieutenant J.K. Edwards, he recorded his experience for BBC Radio.
I let out a hoarse cry of fighters as I heaved back on the stick and kicked on full left rudder to avoid the stream of tracer bullets that I could see passing just ahead of us. The throttles were wide open now, and I rammed the nose down to get into the broken cloud, which was about 1,000 feet below us. We seemed to take an age to reach that wretched cloud, and just as we were about to dive into it, we were raked again from astern. Then followed the most terrible minutes of my whole life. The cloud only offered partial cover, and it seemed as though each time we ran into a break of it, that damn fight was waiting above to dive in with another devastating burst of fire. Bill the Wirelessop was in the Astrodome now, giving me a running commentary on the fighter's moves, and his amazingly calm voice in those moments of sickening fear did a lot to help me, but we could not get away.
That wireless operator, Billy Randall, remembers the Focke-Wulf's persistence only too well.
Well, it took him about 6 attacks before the actual engine caught fire. And in no time at all, Jim gave the order to bail out. But unfortunately, I was not in a position to get out of the aircraft quickly enough. And 3 of the soldiers were badly injured because the first time the aircraft fired, it hit the fuselage where the actual soldiers were.
Now I was in a terrible quandary, flying an almost uncontrollable aircraft with 3 wounded men on board and a Jerry fighter lurking about somewhere, waiting to put in another attack. I had to stay in the aircraft, that was obvious, but which way to turn, how to get her down? My problem was answered when, with a sickening roar, both props went into fully fine pitch, which means, in effect, that the engines ran away and would seize up and possibly explode at any moment. So I had no alternative but to close the throttles and put her down at once.
Oh dear, there's me trying to get my parachute on. I mean, it's quite a steep dive. The next thing, old Jim was standing in his seat with the hatch above him open. And all of a sudden, as I say, we came into a forest of new trees. Jim was flung out of the aircraft through the escape hatch above his head. And unfortunately, as he came out, the flames burnt his face very, very badly. I myself owe my life to Jim.
They had crash-landed into a Dutch forest and were later rescued by the resistance. For his bravery in staying with his aircraft and saving the lives of 2 men, Jim was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He left the RAF in 1946 with the rank of squadron leader. During the war years, Jim's bizarre antics with the trombone had made him a big hit in the officers' mess. So on Demorp, when lack of money forced him to abandon his ambition to become a farmer, it seemed worth having a go at comedy. A chance meeting with the comedian Sid Field led to an audition at the Windmill Theatre in London.
When I was at the Windmill, my first audition was very embarrassing because I just stood by the piano, and in those days I wore a funny outfit. I had a top hat, and I had a bow tie, a stiff collar, and trousers, a tail suit, and bicycle clips, and spats. It was meant to be funny, and Mr. Van Dam, who was the managing director of the Windmill Theatre, he stood beside the piano with his elbow on it, smoking a cigar. He said, "Go ahead, my boy. I'm very easily amused." And I staggered through the act. He didn't move a muscle. At the very end of it, he flicked the ash off his cigar and he said, "Yes," he said, "you've got the makings of an actor." He said, "Tell me, my boy, is that moustache your own?" I said, "Oh, no, Mr. Van Dam, I'm quite happy to shave it off." He said, "Don't do that. It's the only funny thing in the act."
And it was at the Windmill that he had a meeting that he later described as one of the luckiest in his life. It was with a young writer called Frank Muir.
I was writing for Peter Waring, who was a sort of conjurer turned comedian, and who was on at the Windmill, and I was looking for development, and I met Jimmy at the Windmill, and he was exactly what I wanted as a kind of mouthpiece for the sort of stuff I wanted to write. He was a mock professor, so he spoke in round, rotund English, and I was the sort of writer Jimmy wanted for that sort of act, you see.
Take it from here, don't go away when you can take it from here. Why don't you stay and maybe join in the fun now the show has begun?
Yes, Dick Bentley and Jimmy Edwards will be on hand for the next 30 minutes with June Whitfield, Wallace Eaton and the keynotes, all inviting you to... Take It From Here was the idea of one of the BBC's top comedy producers, Charles Maxwell.
Take It From Here had a very rocky start. Nobody had ever heard of the artists or the writers. I suppose I was probably the best known person, as I'd been producing for the BBC for some years. And then something happened, a very sad event, and that was the death of Tommy Handley, which meant the finish of Itmar. And the powers that be decided to give Take It From Here another chance to do a few more programs using the spot on the dial previously occupied by Itmar. And that did the trick, because, of course, we had a ready-made audience for that time of night, and our listening figures climbed and climbed. And it went on, in fact, for 11 years.
We wanted some kind of sketch formula which we could run, and at that time, the BBC had a number of sort of warm-hearted, lovable family series. Meet the Huggets was the archetypal warm, friendly. We wanted to do a horrible family. It was just as simple as that. So we invented the Glums, and it served us beautifully. It wouldn't work nowadays because you don't get this engagement. It's all based on this curious man-made relationship, which we call driving with one foot on the accelerator and the other on the brake, being engaged. And this is where we had this trapped relationship of very plain earth, hanging on like grim death to this dim idiot, being her only chance of getting married, and having to endure the awful Parglum, who was the archetypal chauvinist pig.
Mr. Glum, I came here specially to meet you.
Oh.
Well, you see, Ron and I, tonight we got engaged.
Engaged? And, Dad, we want you to be the third to know.
The third, dearest?
Well, you and me knew first.
So that's it. I should have guessed he got involved with a woman. So that was face powder on his lapel after all, eh? I just thought he'd been blowing down his sherbet dab.
Aren't you going to congratulate us?
Congratulate you. If you think for 1 minute I'd allow my only son to engage himself to a female of your ilk.
What's wrong with my ilk?
The ilk that brings the boy home this hour of the night. Call me straight-laced if you like, but I've always insisted that my son shall be in bed well before his parents are carried home from the boozer.
We used to do it at 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, and Jim liked his lunch.
Jimmy's prospective daughter-in-law, Eth, was played by June Whitfield.
One day he turned up and he'd had lunch with Winford Vaughan Thomas, and I think he said he'd been drinking vodka and pink champagne and brandy, which wasn't his usual tipple. And he arrived and he was a little bit mystified by the whole thing, and poor Charles was going balmy because Jim was not making a lot of sense of what he was reading at the read-through. So Charles was thinking, what can I do? Because it was live, you know, at that time, the radio show. And Jimmy, after the run-through, we used to have a break, and Jim said, I think I'll go round to the pub and get a beer. And Charles thought, oh, no. But he thought, well, it can't be worse, so I better let him go. And Jim went round, had his beer, came back, went through the show, no problem whatsoever. But it was quite a moment for everybody, wondering, you know.
Take It From Here brought Jimmy Edwards, still in his 20s, enormous fame and a very great deal of money. He bought polo ponies, an aeroplane, and, on the advice of his long-suffering accountant, the longed-for farm at Fittleworth in Sussex, which brother Alan ran whilst Jimmy played the squire with the local hunt.
He's seriously interested in it up to a point. I mean, he never knew where the crops were. He always used to say to Alan, where's the cow this year on the morning of the meet, so he knew where the foxes were, you see. He liked to make himself responsible for the pest control. He thought that was a very useful duty. That involved mooching round the farm with a terrier at your heel and a terrible coat on, and a large game bag over your shoulder, and shooting anything that came in sight, more or less. Pigeons, rabbits, and he loved doing that.
It was whilst he was appearing at the Adelphi Theatre in London that a mutual friend introduced him to a young air hostess, Valerie Seymour.
He was so courteous and nice, and his dresser took me to where I could look at the act, and it was very funny, and the audience were howling. And so when it was over and I went back to his dressing room, he said, "What about dinner tonight?" And I said, "Well, we've all already eaten." It was too early for me anyhow, you know, too early in the relationship. But I thought then, my first impression of him was he was courteous and funny and very kindly.
After a courtship which lasted several years, Jim and Valerie eventually married, to the surprise of Jim's sister Libby.
He was in Take It From Here with Dick Bentley, and they sort of said, "Oh, come on, Jim, it's time you got married." And he thought, "Oh, well, you know, Valerie was available at the time, so, you know, he wasn't madly in love with her or anything like that."
He needed me. He kept saying to me, "I can't live without you, I can't live without you, and you're such fun, and you make me laugh, and nobody makes me laugh like you do."
So was it really a marriage of friendship rather than romance?
Well, it was a bit of both at first. In fact, it was a lot of romance. He wouldn't go anywhere without holding my hand. He wouldn't play a chuck of polo without kissing me goodbye and kissing me hello when he got off his horse. So he was a romantic soul in that way. So that's, I've got lots of lovely memories of him making me laugh and the fun we had together and how kind he was.
Valerie and Jim had a good deal in common. They both loved horses and country life, and they shared a sense of the ridiculous. Friends described them as being very funny together, almost like a double act. But underneath the banter, Val had misgivings.
I must tell you that before I was married, my father came to a party of mine, and I was seeing a lot of Jimmy. Not sexually, but, you know, dinner and fun and laughter and watching polo and going hunting and riding and things like that. And my father said, "He's queer." I said, "No, he's not, Papa. He's not. He's just in show business, you know." He said, "You'll find no lasting happiness there, my darling."
In fact, Jim waited until the second night of their honeymoon before the truth emerged.
We were just talking. He was slightly drunk. And he said, "Do you remember so-and-so?" And I said, "Yes. I met him once before he died, quite young." And Jimmy said, "Well, he was my lover." I felt rather sad on the whole. Sad that...
Who was that?
That he was... I felt unhappy at the roots, you know. Because he said to me on my honeymoon, "I've given it up, it's all in the past." So I thought if I torment myself with suspicions from now on in, there's no hope for us at all.
It's worth remembering that this was 1958, when of course homosexuality was still illegal in Britain, and the idea that it was a condition that could somehow be rectified was still prevalent. According to Valerie, Jimmy told her he was trying to reform. And she believed him, despite the fact that he'd frequently leave the house for days without a word of explanation.
Brought out the sort of mother in me, really. And you see, I don't think, looking back, he had boyfriends, per se. Although, who's to know? Or even he had another girlfriend. I doubt that. But who's to know? I didn't bother my head with it.
He was quite prudish. He was quite a prudish person. He'd never have sworn or told filthy jokes in front of ladies or kids, you know, and he didn't like hearing kids swearing or being quite old-fashioned, really.
Biddy Fletcher, a neighbour in Sussex, who was to become probably Jimmy's closest friend.
There's a lot that was very good about him, you know, like that. But when he was relaxed, his actual public image, he was far brasher and far more vulgar, put on an act of being the sort of person he portrayed, but he was a much gentler person, I think. You know, he was quite different in show business. He'd go around saying, hello, darling, and all that. But he wouldn't be like that privately. You know, he wouldn't call you darling unless there was somebody there. And if you were just by yourself with him playing Scrabble or something, he'd just be like a brother or an uncle or something like that. And that's what he liked, really. A sort of total relaxation of atmosphere. He didn't have to try, didn't have to... And he could be so funny, I must say. He could be terribly funny.
Meanwhile, in his public persona, Jimmy couldn't put a foot wrong.
What does the team think it is that makes a person sing whilst ticking a bar?
The BBC had accepted Jimmy's idea of a curious panel game called Does the Team Think, in which members of the public put daft questions to 4 well-known comedians.
The ordinary hoi polloi in the audience here. Somebody's got a puncture out there. You find it necessary to show your exuberance just because you're experiencing the novelty of a hot bath. Isn't your bath big
Kiss
enough?
me. Go to, then. We'll use this unwholesome humidity, this gross watery pumpion. We'll teach him to know turtles from jays.
Have I caught thee, my heavenly jewel? Why, now let me die, for I have lived long enough. This is the period of my ambition.
There was also a creditable stab at serious acting, in a role that might have been written for him, that of the roistering knight Sir John Falstaff in The Merry Wives of Windsor.
I sin in my wish. I would thy husband were dead. I'll speak it before the best Lord. I would make thee my lady.
And then perhaps the oddest of all. Jimmy Edwards was selected as the prospective Conservative candidate for Paddington North in the 1964 general election, a move which astonished his brother Alan.
Dear Jimmy, he wasn't really terribly concerned with the welfare of the population or the constituents. I can imagine him holding a surgery and someone coming in and saying, well, the landlord's taking me from a rent and the dog next door is barking and keeping me there. He would tell him to piss off.
I think he really felt he might be able to do some good, really.
Biddy Fletcher.
It was his worst thing, because if you're in the theatre, people are paid to come and watch you, and therefore they're there because they want to be. And the heckling really upset him, you know. When people came in, they'd say, oh, but go back to your pig farm, Jim, and all that sort of thing, and it really upset him. But Alan, my husband, drove the Land Rover in which he was, you know, and all the sort of campaigning. And he said, what was so wonderful was when you were in the Land Rover, everyone came towards you smiling when they saw it was Jim. Instantly, they'd be smiling. They just came towards you smiling. And he did get a bigger proportion for the Conservatives. They lost, but, I mean, he got a bigger proportion than anywhere else in the country, so... But I don't think he'd have stuck to it because he just couldn't bear being disliked.
In his private life, though, more serious problems were beginning to emerge, not helped, his wife Valerie believes, by his increasingly heavy drinking.
He wasn't himself when he had a lot of drink aboard, and it's very nerve-wracking living with somebody who's so reliant upon drink, and you never know what sort of mood they're going to be in, really. He could get through 2 bottles a day, whiskey.
He really was a great boozer. He'd drink a lot, and he said he was always sort of 1 degree under unless he drank. And somebody said to him once, why do you drink so much? It only gives you the illusion of happiness. And he said, that's all I need. That's all he wanted. And he'd sometimes, if he was basically not in a very happy mood, I mean, he'd go on drinking until he was cannoning off the walls, and then he'd go up to bed. But he never turned nasty with drink. Never. Never saw him turn nasty or vicious or anything. He'd just become a bit repetitive, and the eyes would droop. And then he'd go to bed and go to sleep, and he'd wake up even at 4 o'clock in the morning, or 7 o'clock in the morning, absolutely all right. He had a constitution like an ox, he really did.
For 11 years, the marriage somehow survived. Jimmy away for long periods on tour, Val dutifully waiting at home and always available for escort duties at polo matches and show business parties. It couldn't last, of course, and whilst he was on a cabaret tour in the country which was rapidly becoming his second home, Australia, Val agreed to his request for a divorce.
He was doing a tour of Melbourne, Perth, Sydney and places like that with his musical soiree. And I had lots of letters full of love from him. And I used to write back to him practically every hour of the day and tell him funny things about Toby Edwards and Henry Edwards, our 2 dogs. Well, one was his and one was mine. And then I had this bolt out of the...
Right. Now changing to a different track.
Dutifully waiting at home and always available for escort duties at polo matches and show business parties. It couldn't last, of course, and whilst he was on a cabaret tour in the country which was rapidly becoming his second home, Australia, Val agreed to his request for a divorce.
He was doing a tour of Melbourne, Perth, Sydney and places like that with his musical soiree. And I had lots of letters full of love from him. And I used to write back to him practically every hour of the day and tell him funny things about Toby Edwards and Henry Edwards, our 2 dogs. Well, one was his and one was mine. And then I had this bolt out of the blue. My darling, I want our marriage to end, so if you could leave the house, I'd be very grateful and we'll get a divorce when I get home. It never occurred to me he had a boyfriend. Never, which was stupid. I'm talking about an ostrich with a head in the sand. I knew he had a life before we were married, and I knew, as far as I knew, that during our marriage he tried to stay straight. But it didn't occur to me that he'd go back to it.
There was more and more work being offered in Australia, and after a lifetime of trying to suppress his homosexuality, it seemed that Jimmy now had the opportunity to lead the life he'd always wanted. Away from all his hunting and shooting chums in England, it was so much easier. It took another 10 years for the British press to get hold of the story, and then only because an Australian female impersonator called Raymond Douglas, who chaired Jimmy's life since 1966, blew the gaff to the tabloids. The following publicity was huge. To most people, the news seemed unbelievable. The BBC producer of Does the Team Think and Wacko, Edward Taylor, was due to work with Jim the week after the story broke.
If you ask me how that expose affected him, I have to say that it affected him very badly indeed. He was terribly upset. I guess I knew him and worked with him for 30 years, and nothing touched him as that did. As I recall, the story broke him. One of the Sunday papers got one of their nasty little exclusives, and Jim and I were due to work together the following Sunday, and he rang me in my office on the Monday and said, "Do you want to cancel?" And I said, "No, of course not. We've got an audience booked and a script written, and you're contracted to turn up, and you haven't broken the law, so yes, everything goes ahead as planned." And he said, "Are you sure? You know, I don't want to embarrass you." He was terribly worried that his friends would be embarrassed.
All the bombast and the RAF wacko sort of stuff was all a veneer, really, and this veneer was really covering up the kind of really the sensitive person that he was. And he was a sensitive person, and he liked to be well thought of and to be able to walk tall, as they say in America. So when you're not walking tall, it hurts.
It really devastated him, actually. Really shattered him very much. And I think eventually it it was all right because it meant that he could lead the sort of life he wanted to, even though he was never blatant about it, you know, he was never never pushed it down anyone's nose. He was trying to be discreet about it, but he just wasn't a discreet man, you know. He had this friend, but he didn't bring him round with him socially because it did make life difficult for people a bit. And so, although it was in the open, he didn't want to mix just with a lot of homosexuals because he didn't really particularly get on with them. You know, he'd have a party or something and have a lot of people, but he wasn't the sort of person that instantly started leading a totally homosexual life. But he never really reconciled with it.
Brothers don't talk to one another, I don't think, about their sexual lives. Do they? I don't know. No, it never happened in our family. If he had another side of his life, he decided to keep it away from us, and he did, and therefore who am I to interfere?
He did, when it all came out, he did sort of try once to sort of say something like, oh, you know, you don't understand what men can love each other just like a man and a woman. And I said, well, I just don't want to know, you know.
Do you regret saying that, Farrell?
No, I didn't. I didn't want to. I felt that in some ways it would have been totally unlike our relationship. I reacted in the same way that he would have reacted to me, which is, you know, that's your affair. It's nothing to do with me.
The one thing that terrified Jim, that he'd be rejected and dropped by his friends and colleagues, never happened. Audiences, too, continued to hold him in great affection. The Glums was revived on television in 1979, with Jim as Pa Glum being the only member of the original cast. Big Bad Mouse, which Jim had launched with Eric Sykes in 1968, went from strength to strength. Over an 18-year period, they took it triumphantly all over the world, improvising and embellishing the script as they went along. And Jimmy was always up to his old tricks to get a laugh, mercilessly taking advantage of Eric Sykes' hearing problem.
He's like a little boy, Jim, but he was so... I mean, there was never anything malicious. And on the stage, he knew I couldn't hear, so he saw me like watching his lips, and when he'd finished, I used to answer what he'd said. And so what he did then, he turned his back to say the line. And then, of course, I read the back of his neck, and I knew when the back of his neck stopped moving, he'd finished. So he tumbled to this after a few days, and he'd got the back of his neck to move, and he wasn't saying anything. And I'd answer him, and he'd whip around and say, I haven't asked you yet. And this was the kind of thing it was. Well, your neck was moving, and then we had 5 minutes explaining to the audience about that. I mean, one place in New Zealand we went, and all the lights went out just before the show. I mean, all the lights fused. So Jim and I sat on the stage with our legs dangling over the pit, and with a torch between the two of us, we went through the show until the lights came on again, just in our street clothes. So now you couldn't do this with anybody but Jim.
Back in England, though, fashions in comedy were beginning to change. The old guard of stand-up comedians playing the same old roles was being replaced by a new style of comic. Abroad, there may still have been a demand for his caricature of a great English buffoon. Over here, parts were becoming few and far between.
The last year or so, he was a bit lonely, you know. He spent a lot of time on his own, and when I could, I'd go over and sort of spend the day and play Scrabble and things. It was sort of erratic, and then he'd go over to Australia, and he'd be there, and then he'd come back. I mean, he went away for about 1.5 years at some moment, and that I think was the trouble, that he stopped getting work, because it wasn't a popular image, this sort of Sergeant Major type, you know. Everyone got much softer and gentle. And I think that he still used to have jobs, and gradually, bit by bit, they stopped because he was away so much.
Early in 1988, Jim was taken ill at the house he'd now bought in Perth, Australia. It seemed as if his years of heavy drinking had finally caught up with him. He insisted on coming home to England, and after a short time in hospital in London, Jimmy Edwards died of pneumonia in July 1988. He was 68.
The funeral was at Fletching, which is the town near his farm. It's the church was packed with a lot of local people and of quite a few of Jimmy's show business friends. Eric Sykes, I remember, read the lesson, and Frank Muir did the address and kept it fairly light, as I think was right for the occasion, even though the vicar might not have approved. But after the service, we all went through the churchyard following the coffin, and as it was being lowered into the grave, 2 Royal Air Force buglers sounded the last post. I think that would have pleased Jimmy very much.
Amongst the congregation and recording the service was Jimmy's old wartime wireless operator, Billy Randall.
Always a wonderful man. Great friend, really. I owe a lot to him.
Nigel Farrell presented Wake Up at the Back There, The Life of Jimmy Edwards. The producer was Ronnie Davis. Next week, in the third in this series of Radio Lives, Peter White presents the life of Rene Cutforth. It's 8 o'clock, and now analysis.